Religion doesn't fade overnight. Even when belief wanes, structures remain. Institutions persist. The symbols, the rituals, the language, they all adapt. Not because they must stay true to ancient truths, but because survival requires it. When we look at how religions move through time, we're not just watching belief in gods, we're watching belief in institutions, in tradition, in identity. And when those beliefs are challenged by modern values, science, technology, and global culture, they don't simply collapse, they evolve. Some call it reform, others call it dilution. But one thing is clear: religions that don't adapt tend to shrink, sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically. And those that do adapt rarely do so without tension, without contradiction. Take Christianity. In many Western countries, traditional church attendance has been declining for decades, and yet the faith remains part of national identity, political rhetoric, and even pop culture. How? Partly because many denominations have shifted their message. They've softened the literalism, avoided the fire and brimstone, and focused more on personal meaning, community, or even mental health. Churches rebrand as centers for mindfulness and charity. The doctrine gets lighter, the packaging more palatable. That shift isn't just theological, it's tactical. When moral authority comes under scrutiny, when younger generations question doctrines around sexuality, gender roles, or historical violence, religions reframe themselves. Some openly reject old positions. Others reinterpret scripture to suit modern ethics. In some cases, they simply stop talking about the uncomfortable parts. But here's where it gets interesting. The core beliefs, the supernatural claims, often remain unexamined. They're just less emphasized. It's as if belief in God becomes optional, or at least adjustable. You'll hear people say they're spiritual but not religious, or religious but not dogmatic. These identities offer wiggle room. They allow filiation without accountability to specific beliefs. In practice, this turns some churches into social clubs with stained glass, and in some cases, that's enough to keep them going. Community is a powerful glue. Even if the theology is on life support, the community keeps the body warm. Islam offers a different case. In many Muslim-majority countries, religion remains deeply woven into daily life, law, and identity. But even here, adaptation happens, sometimes subtly, sometimes under intense pressure. In places like Iran, where religion is enforced by the state, belief and doubt become more private. But they don't disappear. The internet, satellite TV, and smartphones have given people access to the broader world, and with that comes exposure to science, secularism, and different lifestyles. Quiet shifts in belief are happening behind closed doors, in DMs, in whispered conversations. At the same time, there's visible tension between religious orthodoxy and modern realities. Take how some clerics respond to climate change, AI, or genetic engineering. The texts they rely on don't mention these things, so the interpretations often stretch or stumble. Some religious leaders embrace science cautiously. Others resist it outright. The dissonance grows louder, especially for the young. And this isn't unique to Islam. Orthodox Judaism has its own struggles with modernity, from debates over women's roles to clashes between religious law and civil rights. Some ultra-Orthodox communities reject nearly all modern influences, but even they use smartphones, often with filters, and their children still grow up in a world that doesn't fully align with their teachings. So, adaptation is a spectrum. Some change a little, others overhaul their theology, some resist change completely and watch their numbers fall. Religions that survive tend to do three things well. They simplify their message, align with new moral values, and maintain a sense of community. This isn't about theological truth, it's about cultural strategy. For example, many churches in the US have dropped talk of hell. They focus instead on love, inclusion, or service. Even megachurches, which often preach conservative values, use music, lighting, and stage design that mirrors pop concerts. The experience becomes entertainment with a moral twist. But here's the paradox. As religions become more inclusive and modern, they often lose their distinctiveness. If a church teaches the same ethics you'd hear from a TED Talk, why go to church at all? If a religion stops claiming exclusive truth, what does it offer that can't be found elsewhere? This is where some groups double down. Fundamentalism grows in part as a reaction to this dilution. When people feel that traditional beliefs are under threat, some don't adapt, they dig in. They turn rigidity into virtue, certainty into power. But fundamentalism is often brittle. It thrives in echo chambers, but struggles in open dialogue. Over time, as modernity continues its push, even the most insulated groups face pressure to evolve or fragment. One of the most overlooked parts of this story is how religions increasingly shift from external authority to personal interpretation. You can see this in the rise of choose-your-own-faith spirituality. People combine yoga with Christian prayer or mix Buddhist meditation with belief in angels. Some call this eclectic, others incoherent. But either way, it reflects how religious identity is becoming more about personal preference than institutional loyalty. This personalization mirrors consumer culture. Just like people curate their playlists or diets, they curate their beliefs. Religion becomes a lifestyle choice, not a metaphysical commitment. And while this might keep old labels alive, it often empties them of their original meaning. The trend isn't limited to the West. In Japan, for example, many people take part in Shinto rituals without actually believing in Shinto deities. It's cultural, not devotional. In India, the line between tradition, superstition, and belief often blurs. Many people participate in rituals without strong conviction. Religion becomes performance, not persuasion. In some cases, religions themselves lean into this. They shift from preaching absolute truth to offering therapeutic comfort. Pastors become life coaches, sermons become motivational talks, sin becomes trauma, salvation becomes self-help. But when religion borrows too much from psychology or wellness, it runs into a different problem: competition. If you can get the same benefits from therapy, meditation apps, or community groups, religion loses its monopoly. Once it's no longer needed for answers or community, it has to fight for relevance. This fight often leads to rebranding. Religions sponsor podcasts, Instagram accounts, and retreats. They adopt inclusive language, sidestep dogma, and sometimes even avoid calling themselves religions. But the irony is hard to ignore. The more they blend in with secular life, the more they prove that religion is not essential. And when beliefs are no longer essential, they become optional. When they're optional, they become weak. And when they're weak, they depend less on truth and more on nostalgia, habit, or social pressure. This doesn't mean religion will disappear entirely, but it does mean its role is changing. It's shifting from a system of authority to a kind of personal filter, from a framework for truth to a container for feelings and culture. And as that shift continues, the question isn't just how religions adapt, it's whether the adaptations themselves are signs of life or symptoms of slow decline. When an institution keeps changing to stay alive, it raises a deeper question: what is it actually preserving? Is it still the same thing at its core, or just a new product wearing the old label? In religion, this tension shows up most clearly in the quiet contradictions between belief and behavior. For example, in many surveys, people will say they believe in a higher power, yet when asked about specifics, creation, miracles, eternal punishment, the numbers drop off sharply. The label remains, but the content changes. Belief becomes less about conviction and more about affiliation, identity, or comfort. Sociologists call this believing without belonging. Others call it cultural religion, but either way it reveals something crucial. For many people, religion is no longer about what's true. It's about what feels familiar. This is especially obvious in places where religion has been historically dominant. In Scandinavian countries like Sweden or Denmark, a majority of citizens still belong to state churches, even though belief in God is among the lowest in the world. Weddings, funerals, holidays, they all retain religious overtones, even when nobody takes the doctrine seriously. In those cases, religion becomes tradition in costume, hollowed out but still standing. And yet these cultural Christians or secular Muslims still maintain a kind of symbolic loyalty. It's not about faith, it's about roots. But this too presents a challenge. When religion becomes more about ethnicity or nostalgia than theology, it becomes difficult to separate belief from background. That's why criticisms of religion often trigger emotional reactions, not because people disagree with the content, but because they feel personally implicated. Religious identity is sticky. It's passed down through families, embedded in language, and reinforced through rituals long before children even understand what they're doing. This is one reason why religions continue to survive, even in highly educated secular societies. They replicate themselves culturally, not just theologically. But in a world that rewards questioning and critical thinking, this replication starts to falter. Younger generations, especially Gen Z and beyond, are showing the lowest levels of religious affiliation on record. In the US, nearly 40% of young adults now identify as having no religion. In places like the UK, that number is even higher. It's not just a loss of belief, it's a loss of relevance. When religious answers feel out of step with lived reality, people stop asking religious questions. When moral authority is tied to institutions with scandal, bigotry, or outdated rules, people find new sources of guidance. Ethics become decoupled from dogma. This shift doesn't mean people stop caring about meaning or morality. In fact, many care more, but they look elsewhere, to philosophy, psychology, art, science, activism. These areas offer tools for navigating life that don't require belief in the supernatural. And here's something worth thinking about. Religions rarely die in dramatic fashion. More often, they fade, slowly, unevenly, silently. The language stays around, so do the holidays, but the inner conviction drains out, one generation at a time. There are exceptions, of course. In times of crisis, religion can experience brief resurgences. Wars, pandemics, social collapse, all of these can stir up fear and uncertainty, and fear is a fertile ground for religion. But even in these cases, the revival is often temporary. Once the storm passes, doubt returns. There's also a growing trend of people turning to new religions, or at least new frameworks that resemble religion. Astrology, crystals, personality cults, even tech-driven belief systems. These aren't old gods with new names, but they serve similar psychological functions: comfort, identity, ritual, transcendence. Some argue that this proves religion is timeless, that humans are just wired for belief. But if that were true, we'd expect to see religious affiliation holding steady. Instead, we see it declining sharply in societies where people are free to choose. What we're actually seeing is a shift in how people fulfill their emotional and social needs. The desire for meaning is still there. It's just no longer tied exclusively to ancient stories. People want belonging, but not always in pews. They want awe, but not always from sermons. They want structure, but not necessarily from scripture. Religions that survive today often do so by mimicking the secular world. They incorporate pop culture, scientific language, and modern ethics. Some even reframe God as a metaphor, a kind of universal consciousness, or inner force, or moral compass. But once God becomes a metaphor, belief becomes metaphorical too. And metaphorical belief is just another way of saying, I don't take this literally. So what happens to a religion when its most basic claims are no longer taken literally? Does it evolve into philosophy, therapy, culture, or does it eventually dissolve? In many ways, the long arc of religion looks more like a curve of softening. The absolute becomes symbolic, the strict becomes flexible, the divine becomes personal. And with each softening, the structure weakens just a little. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because reality has a way of eroding what doesn't hold up to scrutiny. You can see this softening in how religious texts are interpreted today. Few serious theologians still insist the earth is 6,000 years old, or that every story in the Bible or Quran must be literally true. Instead, they focus on the moral lessons, the poetry, the historical context. That's not a problem, necessarily, but it raises the question, if the text isn't literally true, what kind of truth is it offering? And more importantly, why believe it over anything else? Once a religion is no longer claiming factual authority, it competes with everything else that offers emotional or symbolic meaning: novels, films, therapy, philosophy. It no longer holds a privileged position. It becomes one option among many. And in a world where people are overwhelmed with choices, they tend to gravitate toward what feels immediate, relevant, and honest. Dogma, especially when it's visibly outdated, struggles to survive in that environment. And so religions that want to stay alive have to strip away the dogma. But when they do, they often strip away the very thing that made them distinctive in the first place. Some religious leaders are aware of this. You'll hear them say, it's not about doctrine, it's about love. Or, it's not about belief, it's about service. And while those are noble sentiments, they're also an admission. The metaphysical claims no longer hold up, so the focus shifts to ethics and emotion. But ethics and emotion don't require supernatural backing, they can stand on their own. In fact, most of the moral progress we've seen in the modern world, equality, human rights, justice, has come in spite of religious resistance, not because of it. Slavery, segregation, gender discrimination, these were all justified with scripture for centuries. And while religions have later come around, it's often after the fact, after public opinion has already shifted. That pattern reveals something important. Religion tends to follow cultural change, not lead it. And when it does lead, it often leads backwards. That's not a flaw of individual believers, it's a feature of systems built on unchangeable texts. When the world changes, but your source of truth cannot, the only option left is reinterpretation, or silence. And so, reinterpretation becomes the strategy. But reinterpretation isn't a stable foundation. It relies on ambiguity, flexibility, and often selective memory. You emphasize the verses about compassion and ignore the ones about stoning. You highlight the prophets of peace and skip over the violent parts. Over time, this selective reading becomes the new normal. But selective reading is just another form of editing, and when you're editing your scripture to match modern values, you're admitting, even if unconsciously, that your moral compass isn't coming from the scripture. It's coming from somewhere else. That somewhere else is the modern world, shaped by science, reason, empathy, and the messy, painful process of trial and error. And if that's the real source of our ethics, it makes sense to question why we still need religion at all. For a long time, religion claimed to be the source of morality. Without it, people were told, society would collapse into chaos. But over the past century, we've seen the opposite. As religiosity declines in many parts of the world, violence drops, human rights expand, literacy, health, and well-being increase. This isn't coincidence. Studies consistently show that the most secular countries, places like Norway, Japan, the Netherlands, are also among the safest and most stable. They have lower crime rates, less corruption, and stronger social safety nets. Meanwhile, the most religious countries tend to rank lower in terms of development, education, and equality. That doesn't mean religion causes harm directly, but it does challenge the idea that belief in God is necessary for a good society. Even inside religious populations, The most rigid forms of belief are often correlated with worse outcomes, less tolerance, more dogmatism, lower acceptance of science. Again, it's not about individual believers, it's about systems that discourage doubt, prioritize obedience, and base truth on authority rather than evidence. Modernity, by contrast, thrives on questioning. Science, democracy, human rights. All of them are built on the assumption that no idea is sacred, no institution is beyond scrutiny. That's not comfortable, but it's what allows for progress. So when religion adapts to modernity, it's not just updating its language or its policies. It's engaging, often reluctantly, with a deeper shift, from faith to reason, from hierarchy to dialogue, from revelation to inquiry. That shift is slow and uneven. In some places, religious leaders openly embrace science, education, and reform. In others, they resist, fearing that any concession is the beginning of collapse. And in a sense, they're right. Once you allow reinterpretation, you allow reinterpretation of everything. Once you admit that some parts of the scripture were wrong, morally or factually, the door to critical thinking swings open. And once it's open, it rarely closes again. This is why religious reform movements are often caught in a bind. They want to stay relevant, but they also want to preserve authority. They want to be seen as moral guides, but they're tied to texts that contain morally troubling passages. They want to appeal to young people, but many of those young people have already moved on. And that brings us to another quiet truth. In much of the world, religion is no longer something that people discover. It's something they inherit or opt out of. In the past, religion was the default. You were born into it. Your community reinforced it. Doubt was rare and often punished. Today, doubt is widespread and often celebrated. You don't need to leave your village to encounter new ideas. They find you on your phone, on your timeline, in your conversations. This creates a very different environment for belief. It's not about conversion anymore. It's about retention. And retention is hard when your central claims conflict with what people learn in school, see in media, or feel in their own conscience. So religions adapt. They change how they market themselves. They rebrand, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. A church that once preached damnation now talks about emotional healing. A mosque that once warned against modern culture now hosts youth programs and study groups. A temple that once followed rigid codes now invites reinterpretation. But underneath all that change, the question remains, are these institutions evolving because they've discovered new truth, or because they have to just to survive? If it's the latter, then what we're seeing isn't renewal, it's maintenance, a kind of spiritual scaffolding, keeping up appearances while the foundation slowly erodes. And this erosion isn't just about belief, it's about relevance, authority, meaning. When people stop looking to religion for answers to life's biggest questions, it becomes less about truth and more about habit. That's especially visible in the decline of religious vocations. Fewer people are becoming priests, rabbis, imams. Seminaries are closing, monasteries are emptying, the pipeline is drying up. Not just because of scandal or politics, but because the role itself no longer resonates. The idea of devoting your life to a supernatural message is harder to sell in a world filled with information, doubt, and option. Some religious groups respond by doubling down. They draw sharp lines between insiders and outsiders. They become more conservative, more doctrinal. This can create a sense of clarity and unity for a while, but it also tends to shrink the group, isolate it, and make it harder to grow. In the long run, rigid systems usually can't compete with flexible ones. And flexible systems, the ones that do adapt, face their own problem. They become indistinguishable from secular life. If your church service feels like a TED Talk and your prayers sound like motivational slogans, then what's the added value? If your ethics match mainstream values, why dress them up in theological language? These are not abstract questions, they're playing out in real institutions, in churches across Europe that now serve more as concert halls than places of worship, in former seminaries turned into Airbnb rentals, in countries where younger generations don't just leave religion, they grow up without ever entering it. Some argue this is a loss, that without religion we lose tradition, meaning, a sense of the sacred. But sacredness isn't owned by religion. You can feel awe at the edge of a canyon, or the birth of a child, or the scale of the cosmos. You can feel connected to others through empathy, not theology. You can explore mystery through science, not scripture. In fact, science reveals a kind of wonder that religion often limits. It doesn't just hand out answers, it shows you the tools for asking better questions. And it doesn't demand belief, it invites curiosity. That kind of thinking, open, critical, evidence-based, is what challenges religion most. Not because it's hostile, but because it works, it predicts, it builds, it adapts. And over time, that quiet success erodes the need for supernatural explanations. That's why so many modern religious thinkers try to bridge the gap. They say science and religion are two ways of knowing. They say the Bible, or Quran, contains truths even if it's not literal. But again, the question returns. If those truths can be found elsewhere, through reason, evidence, reflection, why tie them to ancient books? Why hold on to systems that still claim divine origin when those claims don't hold up? This isn't about attacking religion, it's about recognizing the gap between its claims and its reality and seeing how that gap is widening. Religions that survive this century will do so by becoming less like themselves, more metaphorical, more therapeutic, more symbolic. But with each layer of adaptation, they become something else, something softer, less assertive, more cultural than divine. And as that happens, we may reach a point where religion doesn't die, it just dissolves, not in a blaze of rejection, but in a quiet shift of priorities, a steady reallocation of trust from faith to reason, from tradition to experience, from doctrine to doubt. Dissolving isn't the same as disappearing. Many religions will continue to exist in some form. As culture, as memory, as architecture, their songs will be sung, their buildings maintained, their holidays observed. But belief, the deep, organizing conviction that these stories are literally true, cosmically necessary, that belief is becoming thinner. It's not just that people doubt the details, it's that they no longer see the need. If you don't believe the earth was made in 6 days, and you don't believe in eternal damnation, and you don't believe your prayers move the universe, what exactly do you believe? And how different is that from not believing at all? The difference for many is emotional. Religious language can still soothe, ritual can still provide rhythm, identity can still offer comfort, but these are psychological benefits, not metaphysical ones. And psychological needs can be met in other ways, often more honestly, without the need for supernatural claims. That's not a criticism, it's an observation. When the supernatural is optional, religion is no longer sacred, it's customizable. It becomes a toolkit for meaning, not a mandate from above. And once something is a toolkit, people start picking and choosing. Sometimes they pick nothing at all. In the past, religion told people who they were, what they were here for, and how the world works. Today, those answers are up for grabs. Some people look for them in science, others in art, others in politics or personal growth. There's no central authority anymore, and that's both liberating and disorienting. Religions that want to survive try to offer grounding in that chaos, but more and more they're competing with a world that offers grounding through connection, through curiosity, through shared humanity, not through obedience or belief in the unseen. In this way, modernity doesn't just challenge religion externally, it replaces it from the inside out. The functions of religion, community, morality, meaning, are being replicated by secular institutions and decentralized movements. And often they do it with fewer contradictions. It's true that religions offer long histories, deep traditions, stories that have shaped civilizations, but it's also true that their survival depends more and more on adapting to a world that no longer needs the old answers. And that's the quiet tension running underneath all religious adaptation today. The more a religion adapts, the more it admits that it must, that the old ways no longer work. And in admitting that, even subtly, it invites further questioning. Why did these beliefs once feel necessary? Why were they once enforced? Why were people persecuted for doubting them? And if those beliefs were once wrong, what else might still be? This is how belief gives way to reflection, and reflection gives way to change. Not all at once, not everywhere, not evenly, but steadily. In some places, religious institutions will hold on longer, backed by political power, cultural inertia, or economic interest. But over time, even those pillars crack, and when they do, the question people are left with is not what religion am I, but what kind of person do I want to be? That's not a small shift. That's a redefinition of purpose. From living under commandments to living with conscience, from seeking salvation to building a better world. Here, now, with the tools we have. Philosopher Daniel Dennett once said that the secret of happiness is find something more important than you are and dedicate your life to it. That drive to connect with something larger is often what religion tried to fulfill. But it's not unique to religion, it never was. You can dedicate your life to truth, or justice, or kindness, or discovery. You can feel awe at the complexity of life, the scale of the universe, the depth of consciousness. You can find transcendence in nature, or music, or the quiet presence of another human being. None of these require belief in miracles or divine authorship. They require attention, honesty, courage. And those are values we can build together without needing to adapt ancient systems just to keep their symbols alive. So where does this leave us? In a world where religions adapt not to preserve truth, but to preserve relevance. In a world where belief shifts from certainty to symbolism, from creed to culture. In a world where the sacred slowly detaches from the supernatural. And in that detachment, we find a kind of freedom. To live without fear of divine judgment, without submission to inherited dogma, without needing cosmic permission to care, to create, to grow. Religions will continue to evolve. They'll rebrand, they'll restructure, they'll respond to trends just as they've always done. But the deeper story is not about their survival. It's about our evolution. How we move from inherited answers to earned understanding. And that journey, whatever else it is, doesn't need faith, it needs honesty.